for all the team members and organizers of the conference and this session. And so my research is national heritage and archaeology through warfare, the crisis and repair of identity. So first of all, I'm going to start with an introduction and then go through the different themes. And so actually, just to give you a bit of a context, the eruption of the Lebanese Civil War, which was from 1975 to 1990, generated 15 years of conflict and warfare. So fundamental precursors to the war were rooted in identity crisis, regional instability, international intervention, sectarianism, and Lebanese ethnic separation doctrines. So these were partially rooted in the colonial construction of the Lebanese state, coupled with the fight for economic, religious, and political control, and the arrival of Palestinian refugees as well. So these created a myriad of diverging interests, and multiple militias were created amongst the Palestinian, Christian, Sunni, Shiite, and Druzi factions. So these militias fought for political identity, economic power through the reinforcement of what we call ethnic separation ideologies. So cultural warfare shortly followed. So what happened was that in 1975, the IFAPO's archaeological program was stopped by the combat, and archaeological sites were looted and destroyed continuously. And particularly places like Tyr and Byblos were looted with artifacts being stolen, damaged, and taken out of the country. And the American Museum of Beirut and the National Museum of Beirut were specifically targets. So the National Museum of Beirut also is a case that's quite particular because it was on what we call the Green Line, and it became the Museum Alley, and the Green Line was the demarcation line between the big militia factions. And so the Archaeological Museum, which contained the biggest archaeological collection of Lebanon, was bombarded, sieged, and very much endangered. And so there was an alarming lack of formal plan for the preservation of this material heritage in case of conflict. And to save the museum's collections, the director of the Lebanese Antiquities, Maurice Schab, and his wife, Olga Schab, encased artifacts in cement and devised other non-traditional schemes in order to save the collection. So these methods of archaeological preservation are indispensable. They safekeep knowledge, investigate the past, and offer power of memory and identity preservation. And this is in contrast with the Lebanese warlords and militias who reinforced identity crisis, encouraged historical and archaeological amnesia and cleansing to stay in power. So in this perspective, I asked the question, how does cultural preservation of material heritage and archaeology combat and repair warfare, political turmoil, and identity crisis? And so in this case, we will be talking about historical cleansing, memory side, ethics of archaeology, and the role of archaeology in fighting sectarian violence. And so taking specifically, in this case, the preservation methods of Maurice and Olga Schab as a case study to go into those broader complex subjects. And so, first of all, I'm going to talk about fragmented preservation. And so, first of all, designed by architects Antoine Nahas and Pierre Le Prince Ringuet, the structure of the National Museum was completed in 1930, and this was reminiscent of Egyptian revival architecture with staircases, rectangular forms, and pylon-style facades. The museum contained Lebanon's biggest archaeological collection by 1975. It encompassed artifacts from the Lower Paleolithic to the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine periods, to the Umayyad, Mamluk, and Ottoman eras. And so the collection created a curated landscape of Lebanon's multifaceted and diverse cultures, histories, religions, and archaeology. And what's important to understand is that this display offers trails and glimpses of the country's memory. And so these trails of memory are fragmented within Lebanese society, and that is the big issue. So according to Albert Nakash, Lebanese society was torn apart by the Phoenician-Arab rift, whereupon Muslims considered themselves the true Arabs and Christians considered themselves descendants of the Phoenicians and therefore not Arab. And the militias reinforced this ethnic separation to remain in power. So this led to explosive, divergent and fragmented views of history, archaeology and interests, where militia factions traced their origin to what they thought of as different civilizations and ancestors to control people and narratives. And so these ideas can be addressed as historical ethnic distortions, where cultural materials are used to perpetuate distorted views of a people's historical identity for the purpose of conflict. And so this is, in this case, preservation of material identity heritage is necessary, especially against such separatist distortions. So conscious of the importance of the collection and its narrative meaning, Maurice Schab reinforced security measures and alarms at the museum in 1975. However, the rapid escalation of the situation led to its closure, with objects starting to disappear as early as April of 1975 for those purposes. And so Schab's early preservation methods was to separate the collection and the memories they held. So what happened is, with the help of Elie Aboud, who was the chief of affairs, and Olga Schab, he transferred precious objects to the first floor in sealed boxes. A selection of precious coins and jewelry, including Ottoman pieces, are then transferred to the central bank. So by slowly separating and fragmenting the collection of the museum in different locations and places, Schab made it harder for looters to access specific objects and perpetuate historically distorted separatist narratives. So the fragmentation of Lebanese archaeological memory combats the ethnic separation, ironically, reinforced by the militias by preserving the memory of diverse and multi-layered histories, and in a unifying way, right, separating to unify so that the militias could not access them separately. And what happens is that it directly counters narratives of the Phoenician-Arab dichotomy and the ethnocentric narratives of division. So this is important to keep in mind because in Nationalism versus Identity Pluralism, Eliza Bernard explains that archaeological objects from the ancient world, which the museum collection had quite excessively. So they have, through different practices, interpretive frameworks and values, they become living organisms within themselves. Their afterlives, including their discovery, replication, exhibition, are powerful in producing national identities. And so by relocating separately fragments of the collection, Maurice and Olga Schab prevented the afterlife of the collection from being exploited for the militia separatist agendas that justified sectarian violence. So rather, in that tenacious effort, the collection was given a new interpretive afterlife, which is still used in Lebanon in the contemporary context, as a symbol of unification, opposition, and repair. So regardless of the epoch and cultural affiliation, the collection is today seen as a unified national and collective historical wall of Lebanese history, which contradicts the ethnic separatist doctrine. So in a sense, it is made to be worth saving, right? So the collection and museum become a site of memory preservation, doubly as a link to the past predating modern warfare. So really remembering that there is such a thing before separatism, and also a link to a hopeful reunifying future wherein the collection would be reunified, replaced in the National History Museum, which didn't end up happening, but also saw the end of the war in a sense, although that never quite happened. Right? But still. So another important aspect of this, the opposing afterlife of the collection showcases that history, archaeology, and preservations in time of conflict is resilient through interwoven with personal experiences as a form of resistance for the greater collective. Actually, perfect. And certainly, although the Service of Antiquities possessed protective materials for the evacuation of the collection, there was no official and defined governmental protective measures in case of conflict. And so there was no plan to safekeep the collection, which was left extremely vulnerable. and especially considering that the ferocity of the events in Damour and Karantina led to Maurice Cheb ordering an inventory of the secured objects, because the secured objects had not been, they were left for free in a sense, like no one was actually documenting what was going on, and so he decided to do so. So coupled with Olga Cheb, a monk and a military chief, Cheb then transfers most objects from the first floor into the basement. This takes place slowly from 1976 to 1978, as the museum falls under the siege of different militia factions. And again, to go back to this idea of the lack of governmental support, in 1977, Maurice Cheb asks the army to evacuate the artifacts, but that never comes to happen. So they just leave the artifacts and the collection in the hands of the militia factions, who actually did take over the museum, right? They entered the museum, that was quite dangerous. So faced with the lack of governmental and institutional help, Olga Cheb particularly secretly sneaks into the first floor's exhibition rooms from a door that led to the office, the Directorate of Antiquities. And this was particularly risky because militiamen had occupied the ground floor. So in an interview, Maurice Cheb, and this is the interview in question actually, where you could see pictures of the museum under the siege of the militiamen, and this is a picture of Maurice. So in this interview, he explains that the location of the moved objects was kept secret between him, Olga, and the president of the Lebanese Republic, because this was quite important that it wouldn't fall into the hands of the militiamen, which had already taken over the museum, right? And so what happens is that the individual archaeological experience becomes an essential part of historical preservation in times of conflict. And in her research, Relations of Remembrance, Sarah Jones relates the stories of her grandparents, her personal story, to British imperialism and colonialism. Jones says, the best stories are the ones we tell ourselves and each other. These two are the stories that shape us, that help us understand who we are and where we came from. These are the stories that we call memories. And as Jones explains, these stories become part of intergenerational memories and identities, which is supported by technologies of remembrance, media, objects, and when we say objects, we do mean artifacts as well, photographs, etc., that are passed on from one generation to the next. And so personal stories are deeply woven into national memory, especially in the memory of a country that lacked and still lacks today an official, strong, and unified collective historical account of Lebanese history pre, during, and post-Civil War. So what ends up happening is that the Cheb's personal stories of secretly transferring archaeological objects, so there's technologies of remembrance, creates both the memory of standing up to the militias and the preservation of memory of the material culture. So it's very twofold in this sense. And so it repairs and fills in a gap created by the lack of governmental control and later the gap in historical accounts of the war. So the defiance of the militia siege is not only a stance against the ethnic and cultural separatism imposed by those doctrines, but also it's the replacement of institutional governmental bodies that protect the material rights of their people. And so the personal becomes ethically political, and the history of the war can be retraced to the history of the Cheb's personal preservation methods. So by taking on the preservation role of the state, the Chebs reinforced and repaired the notion of archaeological material as the ethical rights of the citizens of Lebanon and not the rights of the militias. And both on a personal and national level, it delves into people's collective and identity rights to remember and access their past. And certainly the archaeological materials become repairing technologies of remembrance on several levels. So as memories of a culturally diverse country and the memory of a fight against sectarian violence for future generations. Following Jones's argument, we can even say that the story of identity formation as a collective can be seen through personal individual experiences. And in this case, it's the preservation, the story of the personal preservation of the archaeological collection of Lebanon. And so my last point, so my last theme, is also the importance and resilience of creative processes in archaeology and archaeological preservation in this case rather. So it's in this perspective that the individual experience of protecting collective identity and ethical material rights deals with the colonial past and what we call memory side. So in the analysis of Iraq, Maresi Starsman writes that looters are the victims of structural violence and are denied fair compensations for the treasures that they find and sell on the market. So in the Middle East particularly, disposition of the artifacts of antiquities marketplace and the inherent inequalities in the system can be traced to the legacy of colonialism. Additionally, the transnational movement of illegally looted artifacts in the world is amplified by war and the lawlessness that follows. That was certainly the case in Lebanon, with the legacy of colonial separatism and interest in archaeological sites. So towards the end of the war, which was, well, let's just say 80s and 90s, treasure hunters with bulldozers would systematically excavate sites. So tombs and sarcophagi were specifically targeted for gold and treasures and sold to collections in the West. And so what ended up happening is that there was the deliberate destruction for political and economic gain, and this is viewed by Albert Nakash as memory-cide. It creates an obstruction on people's access to material and archaeological heritage. And so by preserving the collection, Maurice Schab was indirectly fighting the economic inequalities and memory side in the colonially produced system. And he therefore did so by preventing the artifacts from being sold on the transnational market. And so he did so locally by protecting the Middle Eastern artifacts through ingenuity and imaginative archaeological preservation, or what we call the imaginative archaeological preservation. And so with the, so actually that's an example actually, and we can see it in the picture here. So within the confines of a dimly lit setting, that's the National Museum of Beirut in the 90s, so in approximately 1991. So we can see that there are 4 men that are disassembling a giant concrete case. So surrounded by imposing columns, one of the facade collapses, only to reveal a rectangular block limestone. So by the time of its unveiling in the early 1990s, the Phoenician, Hellenistic, Egyptian, and Roman sarcophagi had been encased at the request of Maurice Schab in concrete blocks. This had been done to protect the collection from further looting and damage, as the militiamen morphed mosaics, sarcophagi, and statues as target practices as well. So to save the material heritage that could not be moved because the sarcophagi and the mosaics could not be moved, they were too heavy and the military was not helping them. So what happened was that he had to deal with what we call temporal processes of preservation, reactive temporal processes of preservation. So his preservation methods were cemented in reacting to the human experience surrounding the objects. So in the late 70s and early 80s, he wrapped the bigger pieces in sandbags, but the militiamen used them. So they used this, removed and used the sandbags. And then in reaction, he placed them in wood panels, but the militiamen would tear them down to make fires. And as a last resort, he encased the objects in concrete, as we can see there. So there were 94 imposing cement blocks that included the sarcophagus of Achilles and the sarcophagus of King Ahiram, which contained the oldest text written in Phoenician and is considered an international and national treasure. So he literally saved those sarcophagi and mosaics from becoming target practices, so apart from looting. And so this created a local reactionary process of preservation of material objects against sectarian violence and memory side, fought the violent colonial legacy and the creation of unequal systems that create favorable environments for looting and destruction. More importantly, the safekeeping of the collection of the National Museum was a reparative form of Lebanese cultural heritage from the ravages of a colonial past and the post-colonial war. It not only safe-kept collections and memories for and across multiple Lebanese generations, but also created new ways of seeing and fighting the impact of the colonial past. It highlighted how essential local archaeologists and cultural professionals are in times of warfare, and to create repairing systems. And so in conclusion, like a very brief conclusion, preservation of material heritage and archaeology combats and repairs warfare, political turmoil and identity crisis to some extent. Maurice and Olga Shib's preservation schemes fought for the safekeeping of National Museum's collection. In doing so, they combated ethnic separatist narratives, sectarian violence, memory-cide, and the fragmentation of identity. And so through fragmentations of collections, personal memories, ethical meanings, local interventions, and creative reactionary processes of preservation, the material heritage of the National Museum of Beirut was preserved and its afterlife saved. So this archaeological preservation was then given a new meaning of afterlife as a combative unifying force that sought to preserve a semblance of civic Lebanese identity, that of a unified, multicultural and diverse people for future generations. The personal stories of preservations are the personal stories of a bigger Lebanese collective. It is a message of hope, memory, and worth in times of violence. So thank you.